My presentation is Bisexuality and Self-Disclosure with Implications for Pre-Service Educators. So my presentation primarily focuses around just a very brief scenario. So I teach pre-service educators, so basically students that are training to become second level teachers. So I lecture and I deliver a number of tutorials. So our tutorials are very informal, so they're very practical based. And during my tutorial, I task the students with, with creating a multi-level intervention to create more supportive environments for LGBTQIA plus students. And just when we were talking, I happened to disclose that I myself was bisexual, and that when I was in school that we didn't have any resources or we had no supports that we could access, or we really didn't have any information. And I suppose what struck me was the response when I disclosed that. Like, students were basically mouths open, as good as catching flies, laughing, nudging. And to me, I just thought, so you've never encountered a bisexual before? You know, are we this foreign entity that it provokes such a reaction? And then it led me to think, you know, very much, you know, what do bisexuals look like? Like, I had some comments, students saying, I didn't think she doesn't look bi, you know, just very, very, I suppose, emotive comments for me. I was very surprised. You know, the idea of she's kind of girly, like feminine, so maybe. So it really just stayed with me, and I decided to ask every group I had. So I had 5 groups. So I decided that in each group I'd mention the same thing, that I was bisexual, and every group really did surprise me. They were so surprised. So that really led me to thinking, you know, if I don't look bi, if I don't look bisexual, then, you know, what do bisexuals look like? So I'm very much a meme person. Like, I'll go online, I'll look to see if there's a starter pack or a, you know, those 6 squares, you know, what I think, what my parents think, what society think, and so on and so forth. So I really just immersed myself in Google Images for the day. And I thought, okay, I don't eat lemon bars. That seemed to be a common thing. I don't even know what a lemon bar is. I don't wear Converse. I don't wear Vans. I don't have a lot of body piercings. You know, I really looked at these images, and maybe I took it too seriously and thought, is that really what the standard is? So very much it really left me thinking. So then I decided to do a little bit of research. I thought, okay, you're teaching pre-service educators. What is the research saying? So I decided, quite simply, Google pre-service teachers, or sometimes it's initial education teaching students. So there's different terms, but nonetheless, I thought, okay, what is the information? What is the research out there? And I was very disappointed, whereby I looked at pre-service education research with reference to bisexuality. And as you can see here, we're very much lumped in with the LGBTQIA community as like a single entity. So when I looked at all this research, there wasn't any, like, you know, pre-service candidates and bisexuality or bisexual students. It was all very much, you know, lesbian, gay, bisexual. So it was very disheartening that, you know, there is a gap in the research. There's a lack of information, which is obviously very disheartening. And I mean, for even myself, personally speaking, when I want to know what is out there, you know, what are people thinking? So it's very disheartening, to say the least. So then on to that, why is it important that we separate bisexuality? And I know sometimes people think very much that there's the importance of unity in the community and not separating entities. But with that, you know, there needs to be that acknowledgement that bisexuals experience unique challenges that they face. They're not the same as, for example, lesbians, gay, transgender, whatever the case is. And the fact that, you know, being lumped together, it's very difficult to see the unique nature and to see bisexual representation, because it's very important, you know. Well, I think it is personally. And then even the idea of people saying the rainbow flag is all of our flag, but is it really all of our flag if we aren't seen as our separate entity? Our unique challenges and so on and so forth aren't respected. And even from a literature perspective, if we don't separate bisexuality, we're going to very much get research where we're all lumped together, and you cannot gauge the individual nature and the unique challenges if bisexuality is lumped in. And when I speak, I suppose I'm quite informal, so I don't want to offend anybody with the terminology that I use. So bringing it back to myself, I'm from Ireland. I went through the Irish education system. We had little to no education of bisexuality and LGBTQIA plus issues, not at all, so there really was nothing. So you could say that I didn't hear the word bisexual until I was actually out of the school system. So there really is a lack of, in the practical setting, on the ground level, absolutely nothing. So very much that was quite disheartening for me. However, looking today, the current situation in Ireland regarding pre-service education, so very much the same as our research, bisexuality is not addressed as a single entity specifically where teachers are provided with resources and supports. So for example, the pre-service teachers that I teach, they get information on, let's say, the community as a whole. It is up to the individual lecturer to provide individualized information for each orientation. So you just have here, for example, some post-primary resources that teachers would look to see, and rather unfortunately, they focus on the community as a whole and homophobic bullying opposed to anything else. So it isn't even, very informative on one level. It's just the only issue we face is bullying. It's like, just that is your issue. We will have the resources on that. So very much we are so far behind for a country that has seen a lot of social change with reference to, for example, marriage equality, but in our education sphere, we really are lacking. Looking then, before I recap, is basically some implications. So policy development, we need to create resources and policies that represent bisexuality as an individual entity, still acknowledging their role and their involvement in the community, but we need policy documents that really strengthen that. Looking at continuing professional development, teachers need to be able to avail of training and upskilling courses that separate bisexuality, that look at it individually. Finally, thirdly, initial teacher education accreditation. So the degree programs that we have need to embed components that respect and look at bisexuality as an individual component. Whole school curriculum planning, incorporating the use of, for example, bisexual figures in history, whether it's music. We really need to embed bisexuality as a singular nature within each module where possible, or each subject. And finally, just higher educational practices at module level. So myself, I'm a lecturer. Where possible, I try to embed bisexuality as appropriate. I'm not the singular mouthpiece getting up my soapbox, but very much where possible, I try to integrate, bisexuality as its individual component in my inclusive education. My take home message really is what I've been saying, is that bisexuality does need its own individual component to be part of a pre-service education program. And that is me. So Gurav Mila Mahagat, that means thank you in Irish, and that's me.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was terrific.
Sorry, I rushed so fast. Like, I'm not used to presenting in this format, so I do apologize if I talk too fast.
It was great. You were great.
Thanks.
We have a question from Stephen.
Hi. One of the things that was interesting to me about your presentation is the reaction of the students. And I wonder if there's a difference between the way a woman is perceived if she doesn't have a male partner as opposed to a female partner. That is, if you have a male partner, then obviously you're taken, you're under the ownership of someone. Whereas if you have a female partner, then that leaves that possibility open. And I'm wondering if there's a gender bias in terms of the way students respond.
I believe so. Even from my own experience of it, another colleague of mine, he is a male bisexual, and he disclosed his class, and he had a very harsh reaction. He was very much dismissed, more so than I was. And I definitely believe there is that gender bias. On one level, some students didn't believe it, so I don't believe they took me seriously, with reference to my disclosure. So I'm wondering, it's very interesting what you're saying, if I disclosed the gender of my partner, what, further on to that, what reaction would I get? But it's just very interesting. I hope I answered your question. I waffle a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And your work made me think of Dr. Rosie Nelson brought up Nikki Hayfield's In Their Talk. And And I know that Rosie and Nikki both talk about the lack of appearance norms for bisexuals, which makes it very difficult to recognize. So a lot of commonalities there. Thanks again, Laura. And we're going to move on to our next talk. So Gwyneth Holland will be presenting Queering the Wardrobe, an ethnographic photography project exploring the role of clothing in plurisexual identities. Gwyneth is a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster, specializing in fashion and culture. Her research interests focus on queerness, futures, dress, and the body. And she also works as a trend consultant for global clients. Very cool. The floor is yours, Gwyneth.
Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. So I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on over the last few months. As you say, I am a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster, but this is actually a project that I've developed as part of studies at King's College London, where I wanted to bring together aspects of my identity as a bisexual woman with my practice as a fashion practitioner and some of the kinds of research that I do there. So the Queer Wardrobe Project is an online exhibition that combines portraits of plurisexual women with testimonials from them describing their experience and their identity and the role of clothing within their identities. That was conducted over the last 3 months in and around London. I collaborated with a portrait photographer, Leanne Benson, to ensure that the images had real power and finesse to them. And the questions that I was thinking about are, what is the role of style, fashion, and dress in plurisexual identities? How do women negotiate their queerness through dress? And how can an arts-based research approach help to develop knowledge of plurisexual dress? So, as Rosie and Laura have just talked about, there is this sort of absence of a norm or a expected style for bisexual women, and that was one of the starting points for the project. But I certainly wasn't intending to define a style during the process. What I wanted to do was address the research gap within dress research and fashion research in particular. Again, as has been heard many times today, bisexual and pansexual women are elided into either the LGBTQ banner or sort of grouped together with lesbian women within fashion and dress research. So that again perpetuates ideas of invisibility. And as Rosie and some other people have pointed out, there is research about appearance for bisexual women that focuses on lots of different aspects, such as building relationships or some of the anxieties or stress that come with it. But I really felt like, because a lot of that comes from a sociological perspective rather than a fashion or dress research perspective, that there could be some more nuance that's brought through it by taking a fashion studies approach. So I used this concept of style, fashion, dress from Roach, Higgins and Iker that considers style and fashion and dress as separate things, but that are intertwined. Style being personal agency and individual looks, fashion being the looks of an age or what is popular during a particular period, and then dress being norms or expectations of certain social groups. And so these are all intertwined in different ways that I hope will become apparent during the course of the presentation. I also felt it was really important from a political standpoint to centre the opinions and the appearances of these women, because they have been so overlooked and erased within queer photography projects, within queer research, within dress research. And one of the ways that I used to think about this was Kaiser and McCulloch's idea of the knot, considering the intertwined aspects of a person's identity. So not just their sexuality, but where it intersects with their own personal preferences, time, space, and social context. The methodology, as I said, was an arts-based approach because I wanted to make visible the multiple viewpoints made imperceptible by traditional research norms. A lot of the existing research uses text-based methods, although there is some work that's been done with video or diaries of different formats. But because clothing is something that is embodied and is physical and visual, I thought that was really important to represent within the research. And I also drew from ideas of wardrobe ethnography, which is used quite a lot in commercial fashion research to understand how consumers and customers think about garments and think about brands in different ways. But here it was useful because it allows thicker descriptions of garments and allows you to take an embodied approach to dressing, because you talk about the garments as they are chosen or as they are worn, and you combine them. By combining them with the photography, you get this greater depth in terms of how people think and feel within them. And we did in fact find that some participants, really their whole sort of physicality and their attitude changed from outfit to outfit, which gave some really interesting nuance to the project. We had an insider approach. Again, I thought this was important, that it was a co-created project. So taking a feminist and a queer research approach, everyone involved in the project, myself, the photographer Leanne, all of the participants are plurisexual women. And this allowed us to get into some detail and some common understandings, and also to co-create this idea of bisexual style, so that it's not being created in a hierarchical way or by people outside of this community. I undertook interviews with each of the participants, which were anywhere between an hour and 3 hours, and gave them prompts for the shoot to get them thinking about their clothing in different ways. So the prompts were: what outfit makes you feel the most like yourself, and what outfit makes you feel your queerest self? Considering that those two may not be the same thing. And we originally intended to do one shot that would encapsulate all of this, but we actually ended up doing 3 of each person because they responded to those 2 prompts, and then there were other things that they wanted to cover. There was a real sense in that these backup choices or these alternates that they offered when we shot them, that spoke to me that they wanted to be visible, that they wanted to be seen, that they wanted the legitimation of being seen in all of these different outfits and all of them being valid. As with a lot of bisexual and plurisexual research, recruiting people was like a needle in a haystack, as Hartman has said. And so we recruited 7 people. All of them were cis women. 6 of them were Caucasian or white. And we did want a lot more diversity on that front, but a lot of practical things and personal things on the part of potential participants got in the way. But we do have some good diversity in subject positions in terms of class and body and neurodiversity, which added some interesting perspectives as well. So I'm going to show some a few elements from the exhibition. By all means, go and visit it online to get stuck into it further. I obviously can't cover it all in the time that we have here, but I wanted to bring out a few of the key points and a few of the key themes. So starting here with Sarah, who grew up in Essex, and she was surrounded by these sort of 2 conflicting ideas of the sort of working class glamour of the Essex girl, and this very specific lesbian uniform that was very stereotypical of baggy jeans and short spiky hair and pierced eyebrows. And she found, because that didn't speak to her and how she wanted to dress, it never occurred to her that she could be lesbian or queer until much, much later on. And it continues to shape how she thinks about dressing as a bisexual woman. This is Becca, who is wearing what she describes as her bisexual flag outfit. Obviously, it's not exactly the bisexual flag, but to her, it really telegraphs her bisexual identity. She's very keen, as some of the other speakers have said today, to not be seen as straight, and to not be sort of lost within the LGBTQ plus umbrella. She's especially focused on this because of, you know, internalized biphobia, because of again, working class environment not recognizing or not supporting that identity. So she thinks every single day about how she can say, this is me, I'm bisexual, through the garments and accessories that she wears. Jessie is from a very privileged background, and again, this shaped how she thought about what it is to dress as a queer woman, and using the sort of standards of upper middle class dressing of sharpness and polish, and rebelling against them with a kind of scruffiness. But also she talks about this contradictory problem with being a pansexual woman, of the risks when she was going out with a woman, of being gay in public, but now she is with a cis man. She feels invisible, and she speaks about this desire for a pansexual uniform, that maybe it would be helpful that there was a specific sign that could be universally understood that she was pansexual, so that she didn't constantly have to explain it, and so that she knew where she stood, and so did other people in different environments. Jasmine is from Paraguay, and she marries up all of these different experiences of being from quite a conservative Latin American country, that also, or South American country, that has all of these ideas of what femininity is, as well as quite strict ideas of what it is to be a queer person, given that it is somewhat less publicly acceptable there. And she talks about this idea of contradictions, which really keys into Kaiser and McCulloch's idea of the knot, of thinking about contradiction in every sense, bisexuality itself being about contradiction, and it coming through in her style as well, whether it is combining Doc Martens with flower printed dresses, or as you can see here, the kind of chunky Mary Jane with this very light and bright linen suit. She also talked about this idea of breaking femininity, which is a common theme from a lot of the other interviews, of breaking or ruining or disrupting femininity. And then here, Sarah, who identifies as second generation bisexual, which I love that description. Her mum also was bi, but dressed in what Sarah describes as a very sort of KD Lang 90s lesbian kind of a vibe, you know, with the oversized jeans and button-up shirts and very short hair, which has really impacted how she thinks about what it is to dress as a queer woman. And she thinks of herself as fairly masculine in style, on the sort of butch end of the scale. But she notes that because she is a plus-size woman and she has a womanly body, that she gets read with her size. And so she ends up being read as a kind of a mumsy white woman, because it's difficult for her to be as androgynous as she would like because of the curves of her body. So some of the key themes from the research are this desire to be seen and understood as plurisexuals, which comes through from the extant research as well. But that identity of position also affects legibility, particularly when it comes to size and class. Throughout, there was this sense of parameters being set by gender and queer defaults, that you can only work within masculine and feminine to a degree, that you have to dress against traditional or stereotypical lesbian styles, or adopt elements of those to be read as queer at all. And throughout this idea of monosexual identity and monosexual style, fashion and dress impinging a lot on what people can draw from. There's an interesting use of queer totems, particularly Dr. Martins came through in nearly every interview and every shoot, but it was never a straight up DM boot. It was a platform, like you can see here on Jasmine. It was a sandal, it was a shoe, it was a Mary Jane. So creating different ways or different twists on these queer totems that could be adopted in a way that they felt was distinctively bisexual or pansexual. And again, throughout this idea of assemblage, that a look is not wholesale, and none of them wanted to have this kind of uniform that they'd seen in Paraguay or in Brighton or in Essex of what a queer woman looked like. They wanted to assemble it with things of their own personality and their own preferences. So the turning this knot of all of these different influences in different ways to emphasize different parts of their identity or their personality. So just to conclude, the arts-based research approach was really helpful in enabling a more nuanced approach and getting more detail and more visibility for this kind of research and enabling a wider audience to engage with some of these topics. We've already had several hundred individual users of the website since it launched a couple of weeks ago, and it's helping to raise some of these issues and get people thinking in a different way. Again, while there was no desire to particularly come up with a universal bisexual, pansexual or plurisexual style, some nuances of that started to emerge during the process that allow people to feel legible and to be legible in different scenarios. Obviously, with some of the recruitment difficulties and some of the challenges of doing a project like this where people are visible within the photographs, there were challenges in recruitment, and we're now starting a second phase where we can include a wider range and of more diverse subject positions. So anyone viewing who's in or around London who wants to participate, hit me up. But this project really was here to start conversations about shifting perceptions in this area, to start to draw attention to these gaps within dress research, and to start to challenge the monosexual hegemony within dress research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gwyneth. What a really fascinating and much needed topic and work. There is a quick question in the chat from Mike, just asking about why you decided to focus on bisexual women as opposed to or at the exclusion of bisexual men.
It was mainly a practical choice given the time and the parameters we had, but I felt that because of it, partly my experience as well as being a bisexual woman, we wanted to focus specifically on one demographic, and doing this research has clarified how important it is to do more research outside of monosexual identities. There's definitely a lot of work to be done in terms of gender non-conforming, in terms of gender fluid people, and those that sit outside of those neat boxes of monosexual lesbian women and gay men. There's loads of really interesting research about gay men's dress and some about lesbian women's dress, but I suppose it came from a personal perspective and a practicality perspective. But there is absolutely, this is just a drop in the bucket. There is an enormous amount of work that still needs to be done in terms of dress and sexuality and within plurisexuality.
Great, thank you so much, Gwyneth. Okay, I think we will move on to our next talk in the interest of time. So G. Stone will be speaking today about the double-edged sword, sexual identity concealment for survival among women of color. G. Stone is a certified and board-approved clinical sexologist, certified master's sexpert, relationship and intimacy coach, an intimacy coordinator for TV and film, and founder of Straight But Not Narrow Ladies. As the founder, G curates safer spaces in the form of community events, retreats, and travel experiences for bisexual, queer, questioning, and fluid women. So welcome, G, and I will pass the floor over to you.
Thank you. My work is really centered on bisexual women, and specifically for today, I'm going to focus on women of color. That's the largest audience that I have in front of me now, and I feel like their stories, in a sense, sometimes get overlooked. And it was important to me to kind of identify or to speak on a topic that I'm noticing that I see a lot more often in my day-to-day interactions. So I'm not really trusting my technology, so I'm just going to read, so bear with me. The double-edged sword, sexual identity concealment for survival among women of color. Culturally, many women of color have unhealthy relationships with sex, sexuality, and gender roles. This can be viewed as one of the many impacts of slavery and the colonialism of Black and Brown people. Every culture, society, and ethnicity has its own roster of taboo subjects, most of which tend to center around women. In many Black and Brown households and communities, sex, sexuality, and sex-related issues are taboo topics. These households and communities tend to have rigid gender expectations, strong religious convictions, and reject deviations from heteronormative ideologies. Initiating conversation around these heavily stigmatized topics presents a high risk of repercussion or negative consequences in the form of judgment, rejection, social condemnation, hypersexualization, and violence. This results in subgroups or minorities with ingrained hatred and confusion around their sexual identity. In looking at the intersections of race and gender, women of color in 2022 are still challenged with racial disparities, inequities, sexism, racism, exclusion, structural oppression, social injustice, being fetishized, and overall daily struggles to survive in a world that feels like it was not designed to include them. Sexuality adds another layer of oppression and discrimination to intersectional identities that are already navigating mentally, physically, and emotionally exhaustive lived experiences. To some degree, bisexual women of color have a choice in whether or not they disclose their sexual identities, but in many cases, a choice may not exist for their racial ethnicity. You can hide who you sleep with better than you can hide melanated skin. For many women of color, sexual identity concealment is an act of preservation. It is a means of safety, survival, and stigma management. Sexual identity concealment allows women of color to decide when, how, where, and to who they will share their sexual identity. In many ways, sexual identity concealment is a variant of code switching and allows them to discreetly exist in and out of heteronormativity. But this privilege comes with many consequences. Similar to code switching, sexual identity concealment may contribute to mental strain, anxiety, depression, exhaustion, discomfort, distress, feelings of invalidation, and potential psychological damage resulting from a reduced or altered sense of self. In concealing, one does not show up in their most authentic self. They create a false narrative and offer different iterations of themselves, which dilutes and erodes their sense of self. When a portion of one's life is concealed, how do they find connection and community for their neglected and hidden parts? Bisexuality is a unique identity that in many ways straddles the sexuality fence. For women of color, there are no clear identifiers or aesthetics, no code words, no universal membership card, no dedicated dating apps, and very few social spaces specifically for this demographic. Sexual identity and orientation can be unseen. Bisexuals that conceal or present as straight passing whether directly or indirectly, can perpetuate the stereotype of being deceptive. This is problematic as it can make many feel like they need to choose between reprieve from sexual social stigmas, additional discrimination, and violence, or championing the agenda to raise awareness and gain representation and visibility to a much needed and under or misrepresented population. So I think what comes up for me in doing this is that in 2022, I tend to wonder, does one really need to make that decision of having to choose between disclosing or not disclosing, or in dealing with the ramifications of making that decision? And also, how as a community do we further dull the blades on the double-edged sword? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions for G. Stone? That was really terrific. And I'm not sure if you were in Dr. Zori Paul's earlier session, but Zori was also speaking about, the invisibility of bi people of color and very similar themes as you. And I actually think Dr. Gabrielle, who's up next, very similar themes as well. So thank you so much. Your work is obviously making a really important contribution in the literature.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have Paloma McKim. So Paloma will be presenting their research on the struggle for legitimacy, a qualitative investigation into bisexual identity and validation. Paloma is a recent psychology grad from the University of Bristol. For her undergraduate research project, she carried out a piece of qualitative research into bisexuality and an identity-based discrimination. This piece of research aimed to expand on currently limited empirical attention to investigate whether the theory of identity and validation accurately summarized the dismissal and negation of sexual orientation experienced by bisexual identifying individuals. I've repeated myself. I've been up way too long today. So I will welcome to the floor Paloma and pass it over to you.
Hi, lovely to meet all of you. I will start. Does it automatically share my screen now, or do I need? Oh no, here we go.
Yeah, you just have to click share screen at the bottom.
Okay, so lovely to meet all of you. I'm so pleased to be here, and it's been so interesting to hear about all of your experience and your insights into bisexuality and visibility. I've recently graduated from the University of Bristol in psychology. So this presenting research and carrying out research is quite new to me. At Bristol University, I set up the LGBT ambassador position for the psychology faculty and among the student body and within curriculum. And for my undergraduate dissertation, I wanted to continue the aim of raising awareness about LGBT issues by researching bisexuality and identity-based discrimination. So today I'm going to try and elucidate the term identity invalidation and how it relates to bisexuality with my findings and research. So recently, conversations about bisexuality and discrimination have become a bit more mainstream. And in 2021, I read a New York Times article about bisexuality and the struggle for legitimacy. And the article centered interviews with bisexual identifying people who reported feeling invisible, feeling discriminated against, but also feeling as if their identity wasn't seen, as if their identity didn't exist, because it was often referred to as a phase or as a mask for a secret kind of monosexuality, whether it's someone waiting to discover they're straight or waiting to discover they're gay. And when I read this, it really resonated with my experiences as a bisexual person and conversations with friends. You know, sort of remember people like asking you whether it's a phase, or saying you'll eventually find out, or all of that kind of invalidating information and mistrust of your identity. I was even reminded of sort of like TV shows that you watch and how bisexual people are represented. I don't know if any of you remember, but there's the Sex and the City episode where Carrie is dating a bisexual man. And there's one scene where they sort of all go around and say lots of very problematic things about bisexual people, including, I'm not even sure bisexuality exists. I think it's just a layover on the way to gay town. So again, it's these kind of media representations and constant information you're fed about bisexuality not only being a negative identity, but perhaps not even existing. So I decided to look beyond personal experience and American sitcoms and see what empirical research had to say about the matter. And while there was a lot of reference to the denial or the dismissal of bisexuality, it didn't feel like there was a lot of specific empirical investigation into the denial of the existence of bisexuality as a specific form of discrimination. But one study did stand out, which was a study by Feinstein, where they directly investigated whether identity invalidation or the dismissal and refusal of bisexuality as an identity was a unique form of minority stress. And they did this using qualitative surveys. And while this research was really interesting, the use of qualitative surveys seemed to be a little bit limited, because it didn't allow the researchers to ask follow-up questions and further information about invalidation. But they had a very good definition for identity invalidation, which I'll show you now, which is that bisexual identity invalidation occurs when there's a misalignment between self-defined identity and the way that others perceive them within a particular context. Further, bisexual identity invalidation may manifest directly or indirectly when others passively misperceive or actively deny an individual's self-defined bisexual identity. So I felt like this captured exactly that experience of having identity completely taken out of the picture, because it's sort of seen as this cover for a secret monosexual identity. So I decided to investigate further by carrying out interviews with 6 participants from different ages, different genders, different ethnic backgrounds, to investigate further how well this theory of identity invalidation applied to the bisexual experience. So I employed the biographic narrative interpretive method of interview, which is a sociobiographic method of interview, which aims to use individual and personal experiences to further understand a wider social issue. So in this instance, the personal experiences of the interviewees to understand a wider issue of bisexuality and discrimination. So these are the steps of the interview. So you ask a single question aimed at inducing a narrative from the participant. You allow the participants to talk for 45 minutes without interruption. Then there's a 15-minute break for the participant while the researcher identifies points of interest that you then go on to ask further questions about for 30 minutes. So what did I find? Oh, before that, the question that participants were asked is here so that you can have sort of an idea of the kinds of experiences that they were asked to share. This was posted in the Zoom chat for them to refer back to, and I'll read it now. So, reflecting on your life so far, please can you discuss whether you have experienced invalidation and how these experiences have made you feel? Examples can come from anywhere. Some examples of experiences might be online or in-person encounters, conversations with friends and family members, or media representations about bisexuality. You'll have 45 minutes to talk about your story uninterrupted, and you're welcome to take pauses or allow silence to reflect and think. So as you can tell, it's quite like a detailed question, and participants had to disclose, well, didn't have to, but had the option to disclose personal information, and having that 45 minutes of uninterrupted space, which was a very interesting experience, and I felt was a very useful way to have participant narratives without the intervention of the researchers' intentions, because they were just able to free talk. So what did I find? So I used interpretive phenomenological analysis to generate themes, and there were 6 themes in total, which I don't have time to talk about today. I will talk about 2 of them, and the 2 that I will talk about are binary understandings and objectification. So, binary understandings. Binary understandings refers to the experiences that participants talked about, where attempts were made to understand participants within the binary framework of homosexuality and heterosexuality. Some attempts were reported as passive and unintentional, whereas others were more active, manifesting in a mistrust of the bisexual label and those who used it. And I felt that this theme was illustrated quite nicely by these 2 quotes. So when participant 4 says, "When I'm in a heterosexual community, everyone assumes I'm heterosexual. When I'm in a queer community, everyone assumes I'm lesbian." And participant 5 said, "Some straight women would say, I'm not sleeping with a gay man pretending to be straight." So in both of these examples, it's people being suspicious of the bisexual label and believing it to be this cover or concealment for a secret monosexuality. So within the binary understandings theme, something that I found really interesting was participants talking about a need to assimilate into gay groups or straight groups to conceal their identity. So to assimilate into a monosexuality or a binary label in order to conceal their bisexuality. And I thought this was really interesting because it wasn't something I'd seen covered by previous qualitative research in relation to bisexuality. So attempts were made to do this with appearance, with people changing their appearance to feel more straight and be accepted by straight communities. For example, one of my older participants noted that when she was in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex and began to have children, she felt a pressure to conceal anything about her that was queer. And she says, at that point, I was a mum. I needed to look straight, nice bob, makeup. I had to earn those stripes. And some participants talked about changing their appearance to be perceived as more gay as well and be accepted by that community. So participant 3 says, I started to dress more queer in clubs so they wouldn't think I was just some straight girl. And assimilation was also attempted by behaviour too. With participants sort of saying that they felt they needed to change their behaviour to be more acceptable and more attractive in straight situations and in gay situations. And I felt that this sentiment was well encapsulated by this quote from participant 2. With queer girls, I felt I needed to be a bit more assertive and open with my sexual feelings, whereas with straight men, I should be a bit more passive and submissive. So even though participants were attempting to gain acceptance through assimilation with both behaviour and clothing, this had negative consequences for their emotional well-being and overall led to a feeling of entrapment and suffocation, which is well illustrated by this quote from participant 1. I was strangled by lesbianism, I was strangled by heterosexuality, I was strangled by what I should be like. So the second theme that I'll talk about is objectification. Female participants felt bisexuality was exploited by straight women to have meaningless relationships without consequence, and by straight men as something performed for their pleasure rather than a legitimate identity. So here's an example of the objectification by heterosexual women. Heterosexual women objectify bisexual women and kisses for a bit of fun with no strings. It provokes these ideas that bi women are just faking it. And here's a quote to illustrate the objectification by heterosexual men. I've been with men who say they don't mind if I get with another girl because it's hot and it doesn't count. But if I was with another guy, I know that they would feel threatened. So either way in this situation, it's the bisexuality is perceived more as a fetish rather than a legitimate or stable identity. And what I found interesting was that objectification wasn't something that was restricted to the female experience, which is often something that is talked about with bisexuality. But objectification was also an invalidating experience for men as well, where it was assumed that because of their bisexuality, they would be hyper promiscuous and therefore up for it all the time. And lots of participants reported a dissonance between how others perceived them and their own perceptions of themselves, which is illustrated here. I'm not a promiscuous person. It felt weird to have that assumed about me. Yeah, that felt a bit invalidating and made me feel a bit uncomfortable. So these experiences of objectification and not being seen in a complicated way, but being seen in a 2D way, felt like it reduced the bisexuality to a performative identity, where bisexual people were reduced from bisexual person to bisexual sex object. Yeah, so these were the two themes that I focused on, but if you have any questions about any other themes after the talk, you're very welcome to follow up. So, in summary, what we can see from these findings is that the delegitimizing of the bisexual identity is very prevalent, and the denial of bisexuality as an identity has very negative consequences for bisexual individuals. Being empowered with the information about identity and validation and how it operates, we can have more useful information about how to directly intervene with bisexual people who are experiencing identity instability and who are experiencing negative consequences from minority stress. Also, by understanding the motivations that underlie discrimination, such as stereotyping and denial of identity, we can have more specific and targeted societal intervention. But this is a very complicated issue and there's very limited research on it, and further research using different qualitative methods and techniques is essential. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much for that, Paloma. Wow, that metaphor of, the participant describing feeling like they're strangled by lesbianism and strangled by heterosexuality is just so vivid. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions for Paloma? Okay, well, there's certainly an offer to connect in the chat. So I'll let you take a quick peek at that before we close out our session. Thank you very much to all of our presenters and to all of you in the audience for your engagement and attention. I look forward to seeing you all in a few minutes in our next keynote. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for sharing, Gwyneth.